Somewhere in southern France, deep inside a cave that stayed sealed for roughly 20,000 years, there is a painting of a lion. Not a scratchy outline, not a smudged handprint, not something you could chalk up to idle marking. It's a lion with a turned head, muscles implied through shading, eyes that seem to track you as you move past. Whoever painted it knew exactly what a lion looked like in motion. They knew where the weight sits in the shoulders, how the neck curves when an animal glances sideways, and they did this in near total darkness, on an uneven limestone wall, using ground pigment and breath, and maybe a shallow lamp burning animal fat. 40,000 years ago. That's the thing that stops you cold when you first really sit with it. Not just that ancient humans made art, but that the art looks like it was made with purpose, like someone had something specific to say and chose the wall of a cave to say it. There are hundreds of these sites now, not dozens, hundreds, scattered across Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Indonesian island of Sulawesi. And the deeper researchers look, the less comfortable they become with easy explanations, because these images don't just show up randomly. They cluster, they repeat. Certain animals appear again and again, in the same positions, at the same scale, at sites that are sometimes thousands of miles apart. Geometric symbols show up at cave after cave, separated by tens of thousands of years, and somehow they look like variations on the same set of marks. There are images that appear to track animal behavior across seasons. There are arrangements that some researchers think might map the night sky. There are scenes that seem to record not just what Ice Age people saw, but what they felt, what they feared, what they needed to remember. At some point, the word decoration starts to feel inadequate. These images feel less like background and more like text we haven't learnt to read yet. Now, to be honest with you from the start, there is a real danger in this territory. For every serious researcher carefully building a case from evidence, there's someone jumping from a few data points to a conclusion that sounds astonishing, but doesn't quite hold. So here's what this is going to be. We're going to follow the evidence. We're going to look at the specific sites, the specific images, the specific methodologies researchers have used to date and analyze these paintings. We're going to be very clear about what is established, what is strongly suggested, and what is still a hypothesis that hasn't been settled. There's enough genuine mystery here that we don't need to invent any. If you're listening to this right now and you're somewhere close to sleep, I'm glad you're here. That's exactly why I make these. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I check those every time. It never gets old seeing someone in Tokyo at 2 a.m. next to someone in Toronto just after dinner, all drifting through the same question at the same moment. And if you want to listen without ads, without background music, just the voice and the story, you can follow Sleepy Time History on Spotify. There's a link in the description, and it genuinely helps keep this going. Now, back to the caves. Here is what we are going to work through together. We'll start with the question of what actually counts as evidence when you're trying to interpret art made by people who left no written language and no instruction manual. Then we'll move through the major sites. Chauvet in France with its almost shocking technical sophistication. Lascaux with its hidden rooms and the strange things found inside them. Altamira in Spain with that famous ceiling that caused such uproar when it was discovered. And then further out to Sulawesi in Indonesia, where a painted pig turned out to be older than almost anything found in Europe and quietly rewrote the timeline. And then the deeper questions. We'll look at what researchers have made of the animal images, whether some of them function almost like field notes on migration and behaviour. We'll look at the evidence that some markings may track lunar cycles or seasonal patterns. We'll look seriously at the hypothesis, and it is a hypothesis, that some images may represent constellations. We'll spend time on the altered states theory, the idea that some of this art was made in or near ritual trance, and we'll look at the possibility that certain images weren't recording the present at all, but preserving something, a route, a memory, a map of a landscape that no longer exists. Some of these ideas have strong evidence behind them. Some have suggestive evidence. Some are fascinating and might be wrong. We'll be honest about which is which. What holds all of it together is a single unsettling possibility. That 40,000 years ago, and probably much longer, humans were not just making marks to pass the time. They were recording something they considered important enough to carry deep underground, past the reach of daylight, into the dark, and leave there. The question is what? Before we go deeper into specific sites, it's worth spending a moment on methodology. Because when you're dealing with images made by people who left no writing, no captions, no explanatory notes tucked behind a stalagmite, the question of what counts as real evidence becomes genuinely important. And the answer is more layered than it might seem. The first thing researchers try to establish is age. How old is the painting, and how confident can we actually be about that number? The most common method is radiocarbon dating, which works well on organic materials, charcoal pigment for instance, or animal bone embedded near the art. But radiocarbon has limits. It becomes unreliable past roughly 50,000 years, which is a problem when you're looking at sites that may be older. It can also be contaminated by groundwater carrying ancient carbon through the limestone. A single date from a single sample tells you something, but not everything. Uranium-thorium dating fills in some of the gaps. This method works on the calcite crust that forms over painted surfaces, tiny mineral deposits laid down by water seeping through the cave over millennia. You're not dating the pigment directly, but the crust on top of it, which gives you a minimum age. If the crust is 45,000 years old, the image underneath is at least that old, possibly older. This is how researchers push the timeline for certain European sites back further than radiocarbon could reach. It's also how the Sulawesi paintings got dated, with results that genuinely surprised people. Stylistic analysis adds a third layer. Archaeologists have spent decades building sequences based on how techniques and conventions changed across time. There are identifiable traditions, ways of rendering hooves, conventions for showing animals in motion, recurring compositional choices that allow rough dating through comparison. It's less precise than isotope chemistry, but it catches things the lab can miss, and it helps cross-check the numbers. When all three methods point in the same direction, confidence goes up. When they conflict, that's when the careful work really begins. Context matters just as much as age. A lot of these paintings aren't near the cave entrance. They're deep inside, past narrow passages, in chambers where natural light never reaches, in places that required someone to carry a lamp, to plan the trip, to want to be there specifically. That's not casual behaviour. The location of the art inside a cave is itself a form of evidence. It tells you that the act of making it wasn't incidental. Getting to some of these surfaces would have been physically demanding, and probably deliberate in ways that go beyond decoration. Now here's where interpretation gets genuinely tricky. There are three separate things you're looking at when you study a cave painting, and they need to stay distinct. There's the image itself, what it depicts and how it's rendered. There's the act of making it, who made it, under what conditions, and what that behaviour might suggest about intention. And then there's the meaning we project onto it, the layer of interpretation we bring from the outside. These three things are not the same, and conflating them is how you end up with confident-sounding claims that don't hold. The core constraint is this: there is no written key. Every interpretation of why these images were made is probabilistic. Some hypotheses are better supported than others. Some fit multiple lines of evidence in a way that makes them genuinely compelling. Others are speculative. The honest approach is to hold them in proportion to the evidence and to stay uncomfortable with certainty. Ethnography offers some help here. Studying living hunter-gatherer societies, looking at how they use ritual space, how they relate to animals, how they transmit knowledge across generations, can generate useful frameworks for thinking about Ice Age behaviour. But it cannot be applied directly. These are different people in different places in different times. Using ethnographic parallels to illuminate possibilities is legitimate. Using them as a decoder ring that tells you exactly what a specific image meant to a specific person 40,000 years ago is not. What you're left with is a discipline that has to work carefully, holding multiple hypotheses open at once, updating as new sites are found and new methods are developed. That's not a weakness. That's how you avoid making the evidence say more than it actually does. If you want to see just how careful we have to be about evidence and interpretation, Chauvet is the perfect test case. Because Chauvet is where the timeline itself tried to tell us we were wrong. Set the scene: southern France, Ardèche Gorge. A limestone plateau riddled with cavities, one of which, for tens of thousands of years, was completely sealed off. The entrance collapsed in prehistory. No shepherds used it as a shelter. No medieval visitors carved their names. No candles, no campfires, no modern contamination. Just darkness and slow dripping water, building thin skins of calcite over whatever had been left inside. When a group of cavers broke through in 1994, what they stepped into was almost unnervingly intact. Charcoal from torches still lying on the floor. Bear skulls arranged in ways that did not look entirely random. And most of all, walls covered with paintings that, to trained eyes, looked like they belonged to the very height of the European Ice Age artistic tradition. There was an expectation going in that the best, most sophisticated cave art in Europe would cluster around 20,000 years ago, give or take. Sites like Lascaux and Altamira had set that benchmark. Their paintings were considered late, refined, the product of a long build-up of skill and tradition. Chauvet did not fit that model. Radiocarbon dating on the charcoal drawings, cross-checked with dates from hearths on the floor, kept coming back with numbers around 32 to 36,000 years ago, with some activity possibly earlier still. Later work using uranium-thorium dating on calcite deposits that had grown over some of the figures supported those early Upper Paleolithic ages. Even allowing for debate at the margins, it's clear that the bulk of the imagery belongs to what archaeologists call the Aurignacian period, essentially the first phase of Homo sapiens expansion into this part of Europe. In other words, some of the earliest known cave art in Europe looks like it should be the latest. The motifs themselves are strange if your mental picture of cave art is all bison and horses. Chauvet does have horses, and magnificent ones. But the real stars of these walls are animals that are almost absent, or at least rarely emphasized in many other sites. Big cats, for instance, for lions with no manes, like the extinct cave lions of Pleistocene Europe, rendered with sleek bodies and narrowed eyes, often in groups. There are rhinoceroses too, heavy, somewhat angular, shown from the side with those characteristic horns. Bears appear not just as isolated figures, but in sequences that look uncannily like a record of different postures. And then there are the scenes, not just isolated animals scattered randomly, but compositions that suggest movement and maybe even story. A panel where a pride of lions seems to be stalking something just outside the frame. A group of rhinos aligned so that the overlapping horns create a sense of depth. Animals turned slightly, heads angled, legs staggered as if in mid-step. It is hard to look at some of these panels and not feel that you're seeing snapshots from a remembered world, not just generic lion symbols, but particular animals in particular situations. The shock for many researchers was not simply that these animals were depicted. It was how they were depicted. Look closely at a Chauvet horse face, and you see shading under the jaw and along the neck, charcoal smudged to suggest volume rather than just outline. Some animals are drawn with multiple contour lines around the head or legs, giving a blurred effect that, when lit by a flickering flame probably read as motion. There are hints of perspective, heads slightly turned, horns foreshortened, bodies overlapping in ways that suggest which animal is in front of which. The artists use the cave itself as part of their toolkit, choosing bulging surfaces to become the shoulders of aurochs, using natural cracks as the line of a back or the edge of a muzzle. This is not casual doodling by someone picking up charcoal for the first time. It's the work of people who understand how to exploit the interaction between light, surface, and line to create a visual effect. In modern terms, you might call it representation, or even illusionism. It shows sustained practice, shared conventions, and probably teaching. And this is where the word mastery starts to creep in. Because when you first encounter Chauvet, the temptation is to say, this is genius. These are the Michelangelos of the Ice Age, born 35,000 years too early. But that way of putting it smuggles in assumptions our evidence does not support. What Chauvet really tells us is not that one person woke up one morning with an unprecedented talent. It tells us that by the time these people entered this cave, a tradition already existed. You do not reach this level of control over shading, composition, and the use of wall reliefs in a single leap. These skills look cumulative. Someone watched someone else work. Techniques were practiced, refined, and passed on. Children probably learned how to grind charcoal and blow pigment. There may have been specialists, people particularly good at certain animals whose styles others could recognize. So when we say early mastery, the emphasis should sit on early, not on unique. Chauvet shows that as soon as we see this kind of art, it is already mature, which implies a prehistory we haven't yet found, made on surfaces that did not survive, or in caves that remain undiscovered. The other half of the puzzle is why these particular animals dominate, why lions and rhinos and bears, rather than a simple census of hunted meat animals. One obvious possibility is danger. These are the creatures that could kill you. Cave bears really did hibernate in some of these chambers. The skulls and claw marks on the floors remind you that humans were not the only occupants. Lions and rhinos would have been embodiments of risk on the landscape, powerful presences that demanded respect, fear, maybe ritual engagement. Another possibility is awe. Large predators and massive herbivores occupy a strange space in the human mind. Terrifying, but also mesmerizing. Many hunter-gatherer societies today reserve special stories and taboos for dangerous animals they rarely hunt. It's plausible that Ice Age people did something similar, and that Chauvet's walls are one place those animals were given narrative form. Status may also be part of it. In some ethnographic contexts, telling stories about or artistically representing the most dangerous animals can mark prestige, courage, or special knowledge. If certain individuals in the group had close encounters with lions or bears and lived, their experiences could become part of a shared story cycle, retold in words and fixed in charcoal. There's also the possibility that we are looking at elements of repeated narrative structures rather than standalone images. The lions in sequence, the rhinos in procession, the bear postures, these might be snapshots from stories performed in these chambers, origin tales, clan histories, lessons about where not to sleep in winter. The cave becomes not just a gallery, but an archive of remembered episodes. We have to be careful here. We don't know that the panels represent myths in the sense we use that word today. What we can say, based on the evidence, is that the choices are selective. They are not painting everything they see. They are emphasizing certain species in dynamic, often relational ways. That selectivity itself is information. It hints that these walls were used to record more than just, there were animals here. They seem to be capturing relationships, predator and prey, human and dangerous beast, season and migration, perhaps even spirit and body. Chauvet, then, is a kind of early shock to our expectations. The dates tell us beginning, the drawings tell us already sophisticated, and the subject matter whispers that what is being recorded is not just the existence of animals, but their charged place in a mental world where danger, awe, memory and story were already tightly woven together. If Chauvet is the shock of early mastery, Lascaux is the moment when that mastery becomes almost overwhelming. Move a little north and west in space, and fast forward in time. We're now in southwestern France, in the Dordogne region, around 17 to 19,000 years ago, the period archaeologists call the Magdalenian. The climate is still cold, but not at its absolute worst. Modern humans have been in Europe for tens of thousands of years. Neanderthals are gone, and under a modest hillside near a tiny village, a network of chambers and tunnels is slowly accumulating layers of soot, pigment and memory. Lascaux is not a single big hall with a few scattered images, it's a branching system. You enter through what's called the Hall of the Bulls, a broad gallery whose walls are almost overloaded with imagery. Huge aurochs, powerful horses, stags, layered and overlapping. From there, corridors and side passages run deeper, the axial gallery, the passage, the nave, the apse, the chamber of the felines, and down a narrow drop the shaft. It's important to picture the contrast here. Some spaces, like the Hall of the Bulls and the axial gallery, are relatively accessible and dramatic. You step in, and your field of view is filled with colossal black and ochre animals, some over 5 meters long, horns curved carefully to suggest volume, bellies and flanks subtly shaded. These grand panels look like what many people think of when they imagine cave art, big, bold, centrally placed. But Lascaux doesn't stop at the obvious. The decoration extends into cramped, low-ceilinged and frankly uncomfortable places. The apse, for instance, is a kind of rounded dome-like chamber where the walls and ceiling are so densely covered with engravings and paintings that they overlap in a near palimpsest. To work here, someone had to crouch, twist, lie back, maybe brace themselves on scaffolding. In some niches higher up the walls, only a small person, or a person willing to climb and wedge themselves into awkward positions, could have reached. And then there is the shaft, a narrow vertical drop of about 4 or 5 meters leading down into a small deep room. Getting into it is not trivial. You have to descend carefully. In the Ice Age, they probably used a ladder or notched pole. It is not a place you stumble into by accident on your way to somewhere else. You go there because you intend to. This distribution of effort is a clue. The artists are investing tremendous labour not just in highly visible, public surfaces, but in hidden recesses. Some of the most discussed images at Lascaux are not on the big, obvious walls everyone would see upon entry, but in these more secretive spaces. That raises a question. Who are these rooms for? Before we get to that, look at what's on the walls. Across Lascaux there's a recurring cast of animals and a striking selectivity. Horses dominate numerically. Aurochs, those massive wild cattle, loom large, sometimes drawn in imposing frontal horns-out views. There are red deer stags with elaborate antlers. There's a famous panel with a line of small, trotting ibex. Here and there felines and other creatures appear, but they're comparatively rare. What you don't see very much of in the main compositions is something like reindeer, even though we have good reason to think reindeer were a critical food resource at the time in this region. They do show up at Lascaux, but they are vastly underrepresented compared to their probable importance in the diet. This selective absence becomes even more obvious when you compare Lascaux to other Magdalenian sites where reindeer bones absolutely dominate the trash heaps, but almost vanish from the painted walls. So again, as with Chauvet, we're not looking at a straightforward menu. The walls are not simply a list of things we hunt. Certain animals are magnified and repeated. Others, equally everyday in life, are minimal or missing in the grand panels. That imbalance itself is part of the message, whatever that message was. It suggests that these particular animals, horses, aurochs, stags, were doing special symbolic or narrative work. They may have carried meanings about power, fertility, clan identity, seasons, or something else we no longer have the codebook for. Down in the shaft, the pattern shifts, and this is where things get especially puzzling. Most European cave art, including Lascaux's main galleries, contains very few definite human figures. There are abstract signs, dots, lines, branching shapes, the so-called tectiforms and claviforms. There are occasional partial human elements, a hand, a schematic vulva, a stick-like limb. But fully formed human bodies are rare, and when they occur, they usually look very different from the carefully modelled animals. The shaft scene is one of the most famous exceptions. On one wall of that deep chamber, there is a composition, a bison, apparently wounded, with its intestines spilling out. Beneath it or near it, a bird on a stick or pole, and in front of the bison, a human-like figure drawn in a highly stylized way. Stick body, outstretched arms, bird-like or musk-like head, and an erect penis. There's also a rhinoceros off to one side. The whole thing is drawn more schematically than the big animals in the upper galleries, but arranged in a way that strongly suggests a single episode, because it combines a human figure, a dangerous animal, and what might be a piece of equipment or symbol, the bird on a pole. This scene has attracted almost every kind of interpretation you can imagine. Hunting accident, shamanic trance, mythic origin story, initiation ordeal, astronomical allegory. We don't have a definitive answer, and responsible scholars are careful to keep a clear line between what's on the wall and the stories we tell about it. What we do know is that this kind of human-animal scene is extremely rare in Ice Age cave art. The decision to place it down in a hard-to-access shaft, rather than on the main ceremonial highway of the cave, seems deliberate. If the Hall of the Bulls is a kind of public proclamation, the shaft scene feels more like a password. That spatial separation leads into the question of social function. One way to think about Lascaux is as a place where different zones serve different audiences and activities. The large, easily reached galleries with enormous repeated animal figures could have been stages for group gatherings, storytelling, teaching about animal behavior and seasonal movements, reinforcing shared identities through repeated imagery. The very scale of the paintings, towering aurochs, horses bigger than life, suggest performances in which light, voice, and movement played a role. By contrast, the deeper chambers and the shaft might have hosted smaller, more restricted events. They may have been used for initiations, where younger members of the group were gradually introduced to more esoteric stories or symbols as they passed through a sequence of spaces. They may have been settings for rituals involving altered states of consciousness, where a few people descended into darkness guided by others to encounter images that only a minority ever saw. Another angle is education. Some archaeologists have suggested that the dense overlays of engravings in the apse, for example, could reflect repeated practice, people tracing lines, adding new figures, learning to handle tools and pigments. In that sense, these crammed surfaces might be something like a workshop wall or a blackboard that was never erased. Skill acquisition, story repetition, and ritual might have merged into one continuous activity. Whatever the exact functions, they were not frozen in time. Lascaux, like many decorated caves, shows evidence of repeated visits over centuries, maybe longer. New figures are added over old ones. Styles shift slightly. Pigments age differently. The walls are not single compositions but layered surfaces, where each generation's marks live alongside and partly on top of the last generation's marks. This layering turns the cave into a physical memory device, returning to the same chamber, the same panel, you are confronted not only with the animals and signs themselves, but with the traces of those who came before you. To add a new horse or aurochs is to literally write yourself into a continuum of images. The cave records not just animals and symbols, but the fact of repeated gatherings, repeated performances, repeated acts of looking and touching and speaking. In that sense, Lascaux isn't only a gallery of Ice Age nature, it's an architecture of remembering. The grand panels broadcast shared stories to the many. The hidden rooms protect rarer combinations of human, animal, and sign for the few. And across them all, the slow accumulation of lines and pigments hints that what these people were recording was not just the world outside the cave, but also their own presence in time, who they were, who they had been, and who they hoped their descendants would still be when they came back to light the walls again. Head southwest from Lascaux, cross the Pyrenees into what is now northern Spain, and you arrive at another hill with another dark interior. Different landscape, different people, same Ice Age world. This time, the place is Altamira, and instead of walls that tower over you, the most famous images are above your head. Altamira's main decorated chamber is not like the linear galleries of Lascaux. It's a relatively low, undulating ceiling, about the size of a large room. If you stand there and look up, what you see, if the lights are right, is a cluster of massive bison, coloured in deep reds, browns, blacks, and yellows. Some seem to roll on their backs, some twist, some crouch. Their bodies are thick, heavy, muscular. It feels crowded but not chaotic. There is order in the way they are distributed, in how they respond to the stone itself. One of the key things about Altamira is that the artist didn't treat the rock as a flat canvas. They used the natural bulges, hollows, and folds of the ceiling as part of the animals' bodies. A swelling in the limestone becomes the rounded flank of a bison. A dip becomes the shadow under a belly or the curve of a shoulder. The painter is not imposing an image on an indifferent surface. They are collaborating with the surface, reading possibilities out of it. This is not improvisation in the sense of a quick doodle. It requires patient looking, a kind of geological imagination. You have to learn to see where a protrusion can be turned into a hump, where a crack can become the division between legs, where a discoloration can be incorporated as a patch of fur. Then you have to decide which potential animals to release from which forms and in what orientation, so that seen from some particular place on the floor, the illusion will click. The polychrome technique, the use of multiple colours on the same figure, is another layer of craft. Altamira's bison are not simply red silhouettes or black outlines. Many show careful modulation. Darker tones along the back, lighter tones on the flanks, black used to define manes, hooves, horns, and facial details. In some cases, the artist seems to blow pigment to create soft, diffuse patches, then reinforce certain lines with a brush or a piece of charcoal. To get all those colours, they had to select and process different raw materials. Reds and browns from iron oxides, hematite, goethite, blacks from manganese dioxide or charcoal, yellows from other iron-rich minerals. These had to be collected, ground, sometimes heated to shift their hue or improve their binding properties, and mixed with water, fat, or some other medium. Once you remember that all of this is taking place in a space lit only by fire, the effect becomes easier to imagine and harder to dismiss as primitive. Archaeologists have experimented with fat lamps like the ones we find traces of in caves. Simple stone or bone containers with a depression, filled with animal fat, a bit of plant fibre or moss as a wick. They produce a warm, flickering light that doesn't travel very far but can be carried or set down. Under that kind of illumination, Altamira's ceiling would not present itself as a single, evenly lit fresco. Instead, small zones would glow in turn as a lamp or torch moved. A bison's back would swell out of darkness as the light raked across the bulge of the rock, shadows deepening the illusion of volume. Colours would shift subtly. Red ochre might look almost black in the periphery, and flare into rusty brightness when the flame was close. The glistening of damp pigment or polished stone could make the bodies seem to shimmer. In that environment, the ceiling becomes a living surface in a very literal way. The animals are not just drawn on the rock, they appear to emerge from it and sink back into it depending on where you stand and where the light is. The stone isn't just a support, it is an active partner in the animation of the images. Conceptually, that's a big move. It blurs the line between representation and presence. Are you looking at pictures of bison, or at bison that inhabit the stone? For people whose lives were deeply entangled with the movements and fates of these animals, the idea that they might live both on the land and within the earth itself is not far-fetched. Many later traditions on multiple continents imagine game animals as coming from an underworld or a hidden realm and returning there when they die. Altamira doesn't prove such beliefs for the Magdalenian, but its ceiling is perfectly suited to that kind of thinking. The choice to place the main panel on the ceiling rather than on a wall also shapes how it would have been experienced socially. To see these images properly, you almost have to lie down or at least lean back and crane your neck. That posture is unusual for everyday life. It slows you down. It restricts your field of view. You're no longer surveying the whole chamber. You are a body anchored to the floor, eyes directed upward. If several people are in the room at once, they are all oriented in roughly the same way, all gazing at the same shared spectacle above them. That makes the ceiling a ready-made stage for communal viewing, storytelling, or ceremony. It's easy to imagine someone with a lamp moving it slowly across the bison, while others watch, the animals flaring into being and then dissolving. A storyteller could sync words to the passage of light. This one is the great bull who, here is the cow who. There might be lessons about hunting techniques, seasonal migrations, or mythic events wrapped into the sequence. We have to be careful here. We don't have a Magdalenian script telling us, at Altamira we performed such and such ritual on the full moon of spring. But we do have the architecture of experience, a low, bulging ceiling, carefully placed multicoloured animals that depend on oblique flickering light to achieve their full effect, a room size that can accommodate a small group but not a vast crowd. All of this invites, and almost enforces, a collective mode of looking. Altamira is also a good place to notice something that will matter again and again as we think about Ice Age art. The experience is controlled. What you see depends on where you stand, where you sit or lie, where the lamps are placed, how they move, and how many people are sharing that light with you. The artists are not just recording animals, they are designing encounters with those animals. This idea of controlled experience, of images whose meaning and impact change dramatically with viewpoint and illumination, will come back when we look at more abstract signs, at possible calendars, and at star-like dot clusters. Again and again, the caves seem to be telling us that for these people, knowledge was not just something you had, it was something you entered, step by step, angle by angle, light by light, until the figures in the stone revealed what they were ready to show. Now let's leave Europe altogether. If you zoom out on a map of Ice Age art, there's a long-standing habit of keeping the spotlight on France and Spain, as if deep time creativity was a European invention that later spread outward. For a long time, that seemed to fit the evidence we had. Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira, El Castillo, all those famous names clustered in one corner of the world. Then people started looking more carefully at the limestone hills of southern Sulawesi in what is now Indonesia, the Maros Pangkep Karst, a landscape of jagged towers and caves cut into the tropics. The paintings there were known locally and even documented by scholars in the 20th century, but they didn't get slotted into the big story. They were assumed to be relatively recent, maybe a few thousand years old at most, Interesting, but not world-shaking. That changed when archaeologists began to date them with the same seriousness applied to European caves. The results quietly rewrote the timeline. If you walk into one of these Sulawesi caves, you see something that feels instantly familiar from the other side of the planet. Red hand stencils made by placing a hand on the rock and blowing pigment around it. Animal figures, warty pigs with bristling backs and expressive faces, dwarf buffalo called anoa. Sometimes the animals are flanked by lines and abstract marks, sometimes by more hand stencils, layered and overlapping. To understand why this mattered, you have to look at how the ages were measured. For a long time, dating cave art was limited by what you could date directly, charcoal drawings, or the sediment they were buried in. In Sulawesi, many images are made not with charcoal but with mineral pigments like red ochre, which don't contain carbon and so can't be carbon dated. Instead, researchers looked at something else growing on the walls: tiny crusts of mineral deposits, thin skins of calcite formed by dripping water. These deposits sometimes grow on top of the paintings, partly covering them. That gives you a built-in before and after. Find a calcite skin that clearly overlies a hand stencil, and you know that the painting must be older than the mineral layer. Those calcite layers contain traces of uranium, which decays into thorium at a known rate. By measuring the ratio of uranium to thorium, you can get a minimum age for the crust, and therefore a minimum age for the art underneath. It's not this hand was made exactly 40,000 years ago. It's this hand is at least 40,000 years old and probably older. When teams applied this uranium-thorium method to Maros Pankep, the numbers that came back were startling. Some of the hand stencils clocked in at more than 39,000 years old. One reddish-purple babirusa, a kind of wild pig, had a minimum age of around 35,000 years, later joined by another pig painting that seems to be over 45,000 years old. Those ages put Sulawesi right alongside, and in some cases earlier than, the famous Aurignacian art of Europe. In other words, while people in France were blowing pigment around their hands at El Castillo, people in Indonesia were doing the same thing on cave walls half a world away. Europe was not the singular birthplace of deep cave art. It was one branch of a much wider flowering. You can feel the implications of that in the motifs themselves. The themes in Sulawesi are not identical to those in France and Spain. No bison herds here, no lions, but they rhyme. There are the hands, repeated over and over. They are large, important animals, the kind that mattered economically and probably spiritually. There are repeated arrangements, animals framed by clusters of hand stencils, animals paired or grouped in ways that suggest interaction. This convergence raises an uncomfortable but interesting question. When we see hands, big animals, and recurring patterns in Europe and in Indonesia, separated by oceans and tens of thousands of kilometers, what exactly are we looking at? A shared origin story that spread with migrating populations? Or independent inventions, the same kinds of images emerging from the same kinds of minds faced with similar lives? The archaeology doesn't support the idea that people in Sulawesi were copying Europeans, or vice versa. These traditions appear to have deep local roots. The safer assumption is convergent behavior. Given a certain kind of brain, a certain kind of social life, and a certain intimacy with large animals, there are only so many symbolic strategies that will feel natural. Hands are the simplest possible self-mark. You don't need a prior artistic tradition to make one. You need a hand, some pigment, a willingness to press your body against stone and leave a trace. Large animals are the most obvious focus for attention in a hunter-gatherer world. They are food, danger, wealth, myth, and calendar all wrapped together. Repeated motifs, lines, clusters, arrangements, are what happen when images stop being one-off gestures and become part of shared habits. In that sense, Sulawesi doesn't just add another dot to the map. It tells us something about the baseline capabilities of humans tens of thousands of years ago. Symbolic capacity, the ability to treat marks and images as standing for something, to invest them with shared meaning, was not a late luxury that appeared in one region and spread slowly. It was already widespread, early, and embedded in normal social life. Think about what it takes for hand stencils to accumulate on the same wall over what might be many generations. It means people are returning to the same place, treating that surface as significant. It means children are watching adults place their hands and blow pigment and are later allowed to do it themselves. It suggests that we put our hands here is not just an individual impulse, but a group practice with a story wrapped around it. The same goes for the animals. A carefully outlined pig or buffalo is not just a doodle. It takes time, planning, pigment gathering, and the willingness of others to make space, carry lamps, tolerate smoke, and perhaps participate in whatever words or acts accompany the painting. This is art as a social event, not a private pastime, but similarity can mislead us if we're not careful. It is tempting to see the red hands of Sulawesi and the red hands of El Castillo and imagine a continuous cultural tradition stretching unbroken from Spain to Indonesia. The evidence doesn't require that. What it requires is something more basic and perhaps more profound. That humans, wherever they found themselves, discovered that certain gestures, placing a hand against stone, sketching the body of an animal, repeating marks in recognizable patterns, were powerful ways to bind experience, memory, and community together. So when we line up Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira, and Maros Pankep and notice the echoes among them, we should read those echoes first as a window into the architecture of the human mind, not as proof of direct contact. These are people separated by vast distances, but operating with the same evolutionary toolkit. Big, socially tuned brains, long childhoods for learning, and lives that turned on the behavior of animals and the cycles of landscape and sky. The deeper timeline that Sulawesi gives us doesn't just move the origin point of real art further back. It tells us that by the time our ancestors were painting caves in Europe, they were already part of a species that had been thinking symbolically and making that think in public on rock, in more than one place, for a very long time. If you stand in one of these caves long enough, your eyes start to separate the different kinds of human traces. Some are animals, full bodies with horns and hooves and snouts. Others are those familiar hand shapes. But even before you get to the question of what they mean, there's a simpler divide that matters: how they were made. A negative hand stencil is absence turned into presence. Someone holds their hand flat against the rock, fingers spread or bent, and blows pigment around it, through a hollow bone from their mouth, maybe both. When they pull their hand away, what's left is the outline, the silhouette, the ghost of contact. A positive handprint is the opposite gesture. You mix pigment with fat, spit, water, dip your palm into it, and then press that loaded hand onto the wall. The mark is not where your hand wasn't, but where it was. It's a direct transfer. Skin to rock. Pigment as the record of pressure. These might seem like minor technicalities, but they're different acts with different demands. Stenciling usually needs two resources: pigment and breath. In a lot of cases it may also need two people, one to hold the hand in place, one to blow, especially if the hand belongs to a small child. The result is airy, almost ethereal. It says, "My hand was here, in this exact shape, just for a moment." Printing, by contrast, is contact plus impact. It's more like a stamp. You feel the roughness of the stone through the paint layer. The colour that ends up on the wall is exactly the colour that was on your skin. It's a more literal transfer, more tactile. It says, "I touch this." Across different caves and different continents, both strategies show up. El Castillo in Spain, Sulawesi in Indonesia, Cueva de las Manos in Argentina. Clouds of negative hands. In other places, like some panels in Gargas or Peshmerl, you get a mix of stencils and full smeared prints. The distribution raises a quiet question. If all you wanted was a hand mark, you could pick either method. The fact that both exist and sometimes are clustered separately suggests that people felt the difference. They weren't just interchangeable signatures. The process, the gesture, was part of the meaning. Then there's the matter of whose hands these were. For a long time, hand stencils were casually assumed to be adult men's hands, the default imagined cave artist. When anthropologists actually started measuring them, finger lengths, palm widths, overall size, a different picture emerged. Some hands are large, yes, consistent with adult males, but many are smaller, matching women's proportions. Others are tiny, too small even for adolescents. A number of studies have found clear evidence that children as young as 5, maybe younger, left their marks on cave walls. In some panels you can almost see a gradient. Small hands lower down, medium hands higher, large hands placed above or around them. It doesn't look like a restricted priesthood quietly doing secret art in isolation. It looks like families or mixed groups coming into the darkness together and participating at different levels. That has implications for what the hands were doing socially. If this were just a kind of personal autograph by a specialist, we'd expect tight control over who gets to add their mark and where. The archaeological pattern is messier and more democratic. Layers of overlapping hands built up over time, adults adding new stencils next to faded ones, children leaving awkward, partial impressions where their fingers moved mid-spray. So what exactly were they declaring? One very simple possibility is identity. This is me. A hand is the one part of your body you can easily use as a template. You don't need to know how to draw. You don't need to plan a composition. You just need to press and breathe. In that sense, each hand may be the Ice Age equivalent of a signature, but one that's mostly legible only to people who knew the living hand it belonged to. Another possibility is presence. I was here at this time. Hands cluster near cave entrances, but also deep inside in places that require crawling or climbing. To get there with a child, hold their hand, carry pigment and a lamp, and then help them leave a stencil, is not a casual gesture. It's a little pilgrimage. Maybe those hands are records of who made the journey. Hands may also have been used for counting and vows. Some panels show series of hands with certain fingers missing or bent. In a few caves in France, stencils are made with fingers folded under inconsistent patterns. 2 folded, 3 folded, all but the thumb. One reading is simple injury or frostbite, and that's certainly part of the picture. But the repetition of particular combinations hints at deliberate coding. Folded fingers could mark numbers, stages of a ritual, or specific roles. The third son, the one who killed his first bison, the ones who belong to this group. That leads to another idea, membership signals. Cueva de las Manos literally means cave of the hands, and the name is earned. There are hundreds upon hundreds of stencils, many overlapping, some arranged in clusters, that look almost like banners. It's hard not to see them as a kind of roll call. Perhaps each hand was a declaration. I am part of this band, this lineage, this story. When outsiders walked in, if outsiders were ever allowed to, what they saw first was not individual portraits, but a wall of presence. But even if you could interview the painters and decode every finger position, the hands are only half the story. Scattered between and around them, often more quietly, are the non-figurative marks. Dots, short lines, branching shapes, strange little forms that don't look like anything in the visible world. Archaeologists have working names for some of these. Claviforms, which look vaguely like keys or clubs. Tectiforms, tent-like shapes or little hatch-roofed rectangles. Grids, chevrons, ladders, clusters of parallel lines. They're not confined to a single cave. You find similar repertoires repeated across dozens of sites in southwestern France and northern Spain, and echoes of them, though with local accents, in other regions. That repetition is the puzzle. If you saw a single random dot on a wall, you might shrug and move on. But when you see the same kinds of dots, in similar groupings, in cave after cave, and they persist for thousands of years, it stops looking like idle doodling. Some signs tend to accompany particular animals. Others prefer certain zones of the cave, the deep chambers, the thresholds, the ceilings. Some are arranged in sequences that could easily be read as lists, tallies, or fragments of something more like writing. Yet for all that structure, we don't know what any of it says. Researchers like Genevieve von Petzinger have catalogued these symbols and shown that a limited set, less than 40 basic shapes, accounts for most of the non-figurative signs in European Ice Age art. That's a surprisingly small alphabet for a continent's worth of caves over 20,000 years. It suggests convention, teaching, memory. It suggests that people learned not just how to paint animals, but how to draw correct signs. What we lack is the Rosetta Stone that would tie sign to spoken word, or sign to unambiguous function. Are rows of dots counts of animals killed, or moons passed, or people present? Are tectiforms huts, traps, or abstractions of something we no longer even conceptualize? Are certain shapes clan emblems, route markers, warnings? The evidence limits us to patterns, where signs are, which other images they associate with, how they change over time. Those patterns insist that something disciplined is going on. They refuse to tell us what, and that in a way brings us back to the hands. The hand stencils announce, a specific person of a certain size and age came here and did this. The abstract marks whisper. There was also a shared code, a set of marks whose meanings were known to many and legible at a glance. Together they point to an urge deeper than decoration, the urge to record, to bind information to place, to keep traces of people and ideas anchored in stone long after breath and speech have vanished. In the next step of the cave, where the animals crowd the walls, that urge becomes even clearer. Those bison and horses and lions are not just aesthetic choices. They look suspiciously like someone trying to remember how the world works. If you strip away the mystery for a moment and just look, really look at some of these animals, something unnerving happens. They start behaving. At Chauvet there are lions with their ears pinned back, their bodies low to the ground, moving in a way any modern wildlife biologist would recognize as stalking. One lion's paws overlap mid-stride in a sequence that leaves no doubt. It's walking, not just frozen in a lion shape. At Lascaux, horses are drawn with swollen bellies and thick winter coats in one panel, and sleeker flanks in another. Some ibex have heavy, shaggy throats. Others look like they've just shed. Bison are shown with hair patterns that shift along their backs and necks in ways that match real seasonal changes. That level of anatomical and behavioral accuracy doesn't happen by accident. These aren't people vaguely remembering what a horse looks like. This is someone who has watched horses enough to know what their bodies look like in different times of year, what a tense shoulder versus a resting one looks like, how a herd turns when it's spooked. If you're living by hunting and gathering, those details are not just artistic flourishes, they're data. Think about what it means to recognize in the half-light of dawn that the horses you're following have just shifted from winter coat to summer coat. That tells you roughly where you are in the annual cycle. It hints at where the herd is likely to move next, which valleys will green up on their route, when the foals will drop. If someone has painted, deep in the cave, a line of shaggy, heavy-bodied horses in one place, and a frieze of sleek, short-haired horses somewhere else, it's hard not to wonder if those aren't just horses, but winter horses and summer horses, a kind of visual shorthand for time. The same goes for horns and antlers. In several caves you see stags with fully branched antlers, others with new growth, others with just the knobs on their heads. Reindeer and other cervids are shown in different stages of antler cycle. In the real world, that cycle is tightly tied to mating seasons, migrations, and shifts in behavior. A row of males in full rut antlers might be less a generic trophy and more a reminder. This is when they're aggressive, distracted, dangerous, but also when they're easiest to approach if you know how. So one way to read these walls is as a kind of Ice Age field notebook, written by people who didn't have paper but had stone and memory. But then there's the choice of which animals end up in those notebooks. If cave art was only about what people ate, we'd expect to see a lot of small game, fish, and plants. Instead, in many sites, we get a heavy emphasis on big, often dangerous or relatively rare creatures. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, cave lions, huge bison, aurochs. At Chauvet, lions and rhinos dominate sections of the cave, even though their contribution to diet seems to have been small or non-existent. At Lascaux, you get the famous bulls, their horns sweeping across the ceiling with an almost exaggerated power. Why spend so much energy depicting animals that are hard to hunt, or almost never hunted? One answer is prestige. In many hunter-gatherer societies, knowledge about the most dangerous animals, their habits, their territories, how to avoid them or confront them, is specialized and high status. Knowing where lions den when mammoths tend to cross a river, or how close you can get to a woolly rhinoceros without triggering a charge could easily be the difference between life and death. Those animals loom large in risk, even if not in calories. Making them loom large on the walls fits that reality. Another answer is that rare does not mean irrelevant. A cave lion that might kill you twice in a lifetime is still more important, informationally, than the 100 rabbits you snare every year. Recording its behaviors, its posture before it attacks, the way it moves in a group could be as much about teaching avoidance as hunting. That brings us to herds. Many panels don't just show isolated animals. They show groups, packed together, bodies overlapping in a way that suggests motion. Horses bunched as if moving along a valley floor. Bison facing in one direction, with a few turned outwards like sentries. Sometimes different species share the same panel, placed in ways that look suspiciously like they're occupying different zones of a mental map. Horses in one band, aurochs in another, deer off to the side. Herd animals have predictable dynamics. They bunch differently when they're migrating versus when they're grazing quietly. They react one way when they sense predators in front of them, another when the threat is from behind. People who live with and off of these herds internalize those patterns. Drawing them with certain spacings, orientations, and group sizes could be a way of encoding that knowledge. This is what a panicked herd looks like. This is where you stand. Or, when the herd strings out like this, they're on the move. Follow the line, not the clump. Even mating cues can slide into this picture. Swollen bellies, males with thickened necks, particular postures between paired animals. These could easily be mnemonics for breeding seasons. And breeding seasons are the metronome of the year when you're tracking migrations. When the reindeer start rutting, you know winter is not far behind. When the bison calves appear, certain routes open up or close down. Animals become living calendars, and their images could be calendar notes 200 meters inside a hill. All of this ties directly into survival knowledge. To move safely across an Ice Age landscape, you need more than a vague idea of where animals are. You need routes, where the herds cross rivers, where they pause to calve, which passes they favour during early snow, which cliff edges are good for driving them off, which valleys are lion territory. You need to know that the horses painted with thick manes belong to the time when that northern valley is passable, and the thin-coated ones mark the season when the southern marshes are dangerous. A cave, revisited year after year, generation after generation, is an ideal memory palace for that kind of information. Certain chambers might be associated with specific animals, specific seasons, specific zones of the wider landscape. The paintings become anchors for stories. Here is the panel of the bison in snow. This is when your grandfather slipped on the ice and nearly died. This is also when the salmon are running in the big river. You don't have to compress everything into a single image. The cave itself, with its twists and chambers, can carry the structure. But we have to be honest about the limits. The same lion that encodes a perfectly observed stalking posture might also be a spirit lion, a being from a myth told around fires, a guardian of the cave. The herd that looks like a migration scene might double as the cast of a ritual story, each animal with a personal name and history. The shaggy horse might mean late winter to one group, and the horse ancestor in his powerful form to another, or even to the same people at different moments. Observation and myth are not opposites in this world. They layer. A ritual about the first bison might also be the way you remember when and where to find real bison. A story about the lions who guard the Western Pass might also encode the warning that, yes, lions really do den in that direction. So when we call these animals field notes, it's a metaphor with some weight, but also some caution. The walls record encounters with the more than human world, grounded in close watching and practical need, but refracted through stories, taboos, and altered states we can hardly reconstruct. In the next layer of the puzzle, those practical notes start to blur into something even more structured. The rhythm of seasons themselves. When animals change shape on the walls, when certain species cluster with particular signs, it begins to look less like snapshots and more like a system, a way of keeping time. If animals can act as living calendars, the next question is obvious. Did anyone try to turn that knowledge into an actual calendar? Out on the Ice Age steppe, time isn't something you measure with numbers on a page. It's a series of returns and disappearances. The salmon run, the reindeer pass, the acorns fall, the storms come in from the west, miss the window, and you don't just get wet, you go hungry. For hunter-gatherers in strongly seasonal climates, when is almost always tied to where and what. You don't say, in November we go there. You say, when the geese are flying low, or when the willow catkins open, or after the ice breaks on the river. But even if your language is full of those natural cues, you still have to juggle a lot of them at once, when different foods peak, when different animals are safe to hunt, when certain valleys are passable but not yet flooded, when crossing a high pass becomes suicidal. The rhythm of food is the rhythm of risk. That's where the little marks come in. Alongside the big dramatic animal figures, a quieter layer of cave art often goes unnoticed. Lines, dots, notches, clusters. At sites like Lascaux, La Pasiega, and others across France and Spain, you sometimes find a bison with a row of dots beneath it, a horse with a sequence of short lines, a stag with a pattern of marks off to one side. They're not random graffiti. They often repeat very similar forms from cave to cave and panel to panel. Recently, some researchers have proposed something bold and very specific, that at least some of these dots and notches are timekeeping devices. Not writing, not numbers in our modern sense, but structured records of how many and how long. One recent study suggested that series of marks associated with animals might be lunar counts, tallies of months marking key points in animal life cycles. The idea runs like this. You watch a herd for years. You notice that, for a given kind of animal, rutting or calving tends to happen roughly after the same number of moons each year. You don't have words for March or September, but you do know 3 moons after the first thaw, or 5 moons after the days begin to shorten again. If you wanted to keep that knowledge stable across generations, you could, in principle, carve or paint a row of dots tied to that animal. Not a full calendar grid, not a schedule pinned to the wall, but more like a mnemonic. This many moons between this sign and that behaviour. On some panels, the numbers in these sequences fall into a suggestive range, up to around 13, which is the number of lunar months in a year. People have pointed out that some animals tend to carve or rut at pretty consistent offsets from particular seasonal markers. It's tempting to see a kind of combined lunar seasonal system encoded there, a rhythm of moons nested inside a rhythm of years. But we need to move carefully here. Those marks are real. Their association with animals is real. The regularity of some sequences is real. The leap from there to "this is a calendar" is where we leave solid ground and step onto ice. For one thing, the marks could be doing more than one job at once. A row of 7 dots near a bison might be a temporal cue, but it could also be a count of kills in a story, a representation of a group size, or a way of marking a particular individual. The 7-notch bison, the one from the famous hunt. They might be clan or personal signatures, ways of saying this story belongs to us, or our group has rights here in this valley when the herds pass. In Cueva de las Manos in Patagonia, for example, later in time but still pre-agricultural, hand stencils cluster in what look like distinct groupings, and some researchers have suggested they function as identity markers. In Europe, clusters of dots or repeated abstract motifs could play a similar role, tagging an animal or a scene as linked to a particular band or lineage. They might also be narrative punctuation. Imagine you're telling a long ritualized story in the dark of the cave. You move along the wall from one animal panel to the next. The dots and lines could function as beats. Here is the first winter. Here is the second crossing. Here the bison turn. Not numbers exactly, but rhythm marks. Decoration is another possibility, but not in the dismissive sense. In many traditional societies, adding ordered marks, rows of dots, zigzags, cross-hatching, is a way of intensifying a surface, making it more alive, more charged. What looks like mere decoration to us is often tied to ideas about power, fertility, danger, or sacredness. A bison ringed with marks might be a bison in a special state, a dream bison, a myth bison, a first bison. So we're left with overlapping hypotheses, temporal tallies, group codes, story beats, sacred intensifiers. They're not mutually exclusive. A person can scratch a sequence of lines because there were 8 winters, and also because 8 is the number tied to this ancestor, and also because the surface looks right when it's full. The deeper question then isn't is this a calendar, yes or no? It's, if you tried to make a calendar without writing, without fixed month names, in a world where time is experienced through migrations and ripenings and storms, what would that look like on stone? It probably wouldn't look like our calendars. No neat grid of days, no straight line of years. It would look more like a web of associations. This animal, with this posture and this coat, plus this number of moons, plus this place in the cave, equals a particular slice of the year and the behaviours that go with it. A non-written calendar might be a sequence you walk, not something you read at a glance. You enter the cave at the beginning chamber, where cold weather animals dominate. As you move deeper, the animals change, the marks shift, the stories attached to them follow the turning of the year. Certain clusters of dots appear only with certain seasons' animals. Certain signs, like the so-called spray or Y shapes found at El Castillo and elsewhere, might consistently accompany images linked to mating or birth. Seen that way, the tally marks and dot clusters are less a crude attempt at our kind of timekeeping, and more a bridge between lived cycles and memory. They let you attach quantities and intervals to things that are otherwise just when it feels like this, or when the light is like that. Whether any particular set of marks in Lascaux or Chauvet truly encodes lunar counts is something we may never be able to prove. The evidence is suggestive, not decisive. What does seem solid is that these people had reasons to care about recurring intervals, and they had the cognitive tools to notice and remember them. The walls give us one of the few durable surfaces where that concern could leave a trace, and once you accept that some of those traces might map onto the cycle of the year, another possibility starts to glow at the edges of the torchlight. Maybe they weren't just watching animals and seasons. Maybe sometimes they were watching the sky. If you keep following that line of thought, the next step is almost irresistible. If you're tracking moons and seasons, and you spend your evenings in a world without artificial light, you don't just see the sky, you live inside it. The stars rise and set along the same paths, the same bright patterns turn overhead each year, and some of them are tightly tied to what happens on the ground. So it's not surprising that some researchers have looked at the caves and asked a bolder question. Did anyone try to put the sky on stone? Over the past few decades, a handful of claims have circulated that certain cave panels encode constellations, star clusters, even specific events in the heavens. You'll see headlines about prehistoric star maps at Lascaux, or zodiac animals at Chauvet, or the Pleiades cluster painted over a bison. The idea is always roughly the same. A cluster of dots near an animal looks a lot like a group of stars near a constellation in our modern sky. Maybe, the argument goes, that's not a coincidence. There are a few famous examples people keep coming back to. At Lascaux, one of the bulls in the Hall of the Bulls has a tight little group of dots painted above its shoulder. Some have suggested that if you tilt your head just right, that configuration resembles the Pleiades star cluster sitting above the constellation that later cultures would call Taurus the Bull. In this reading, the painted bull is not just an animal, it's the sky bull, and the dots are the small, shimmering cluster that rides on its back in spring. Elsewhere in the cave, other animals have dots in positions that some authors match to bright stars in Orion or the Summer Triangle. A few statistical studies have argued that the chance of all these correspondences lining up by accident is low. In Turkey, at Göbekli Tepe, thousands of years later but still in a pre-literate world, some scholars have tried to see constellations in the arrangements of animals on the pillars. They've proposed that vultures, scorpions, and other carved figures line up with the sky over particular dates, maybe even commemorating meteor showers or comet impacts. These ideas often get retroactively pushed back in time. If people 12,000 years ago could do this, maybe people 30 or 40,000 years ago could too. The appeal of these hypotheses is obvious. They promise a kind of direct connection. Not just they noticed the stars, but they encoded specific constellations we can still recognize. It would mean that when you step into Lascaux and look up at a painted bull, you are, in a sense, seeing the same sky pattern that rises above you on a clear spring night. But before we let that romance carry us away, it helps to ask, what would strong evidence for sky on stone actually look like? It wouldn't be just one suggestive match between one animal and one star group. Humans are very good at pattern matching. Given enough dots and enough imagination, you can align almost anything with almost anything. If we want to claim that Ice Age artists were intentionally mapping the sky, we'd want several layers of support. First, we'd look for consistency. The same arrangement of dots paired with the same kind of animal again and again across different caves and different regions. If a 7-dot cluster always appears above aurochs and always in a similar position relative to the body, that's more convincing than a single instance. Second, we'd want repeatable correspondences to the actual sky. If a particular dot pattern is being read as the Pleiades, for example, we could check whether its relative spacing and orientation roughly match what the cluster would have looked like at the relevant latitude and date. The stars do move very slowly over tens of thousands of years, but we can reconstruct their past positions, A robust case would show that the dot layout lines up with the ancient sky better than with random scatter. Third, we'd look for independent checks. Are there ethnographic examples from later hunter-gatherer societies where animal constellations and star clusters are linked in similar ways? Do myths or traditions from regions with known Ice Age continuity talk about the 7 little ones above the bull or similar motifs? These wouldn't prove anything on their own, but they'd give a broader cultural context. Most of the current star map claims fall short of that bar. The dots are there, the animals are there, some alignments are undeniably tempting, but the number of dots is small, the positions are approximate, and the sample size is tiny. For every apparent match there are other panels with dots that don't fit any obvious celestial pattern at all. Sometimes proponents quietly ignore those. That's the selective data problem, noticing the hits, forgetting the misses. There's also the risk of projection. Our constellations are culturally specific. Asterisms like the Pleiades have been noticed in many traditions, but they aren't always 7 sisters or tied to a bull. Mapping Greek or Babylonian star pictures onto Ice Age art assumes a continuity we haven't demonstrated. It's a bit like seeing a modern alphabet in every set of scratches once you've learnt to read. Within archaeology and archaeoastronomy, there's active debate around these interpretations. Some researchers argue that the statistical likelihood of certain configurations being accidental is low enough to take the sky hypothesis seriously, at least as a working idea. Others point out that when the criteria for a match are loose, allowing for flipping, rotating, shrinking and stretching, the chance level becomes hard to define. Still others caution that the same panels already have plausible interpretations in terms of hunting, myth, or ritual without needing the stars. So we end up in a familiar place. The evidence is suggestive. It's not decisive, but that doesn't mean the sky was irrelevant. You don't need to draw a perfect star map to be using the heavens as part of your mental toolkit. Basic sky knowledge, where the sun rises at solstice, which way certain stars or the Milky Way lean at different times of year, when a particular bright star first appears in the dawn, can act as a powerful frame for everything else. Imagine you're standing at the entrance to a cave like Chauvet or El Castillo. The opening faces a particular direction. In winter, the low sun might reach deep into the chamber. In summer, it might barely touch the threshold. Some rock shelters and passage mouths line up roughly with solstice sunrises or sunsets, simply because of the local topography. But if your community uses those moments as cues for when to begin certain rituals or hunts, then the cave itself becomes tied to the sky, whether or not any star is painted inside. Directional choices in the art could also carry sky echoes. Certain animals or signs might cluster on particular walls that face east or west. Certain motifs might only appear where moonlight can reach at certain times. These are hard to test archaeologically, but they're the sort of indirect recording that doesn't require literal constellations. And there's navigation. On open steppe or along long coastlines, knowing that the path home lies where the star rises, or the reindeer valleys are under the part of the Milky Way that looks like a river, is extremely useful. If some abstract marks in caves echo those same orientations, if, say, a repeated zigzag always leans the way a key stretch of sky leans, that might be another subtler way the heavens seep into stone. So when we talk about the sky on stone, we might be thinking a bit too literally. A perfect prehistoric planetarium painted underground would be spectacular, but it's not the only option. What seems more likely is that sky knowledge, like animal behavior and seasonal change, fed into a whole web of signs, placements, stories, and practices. Some of that web might glance off the star patterns we recognize. Some of it might be anchored to horizons and light, rather than individual points of light. If any specific panel at Lascaux or Chauvet truly encodes a constellation, it would be a remarkable bridge across time. For now, the case isn't closed either way. The more cautious conclusion is simpler and, in its own way, just as profound. These were people who lived under a dark, brilliant sky. They had every reason, and all the cognitive tools, to notice its regularities and fold them into their understanding of animals, seasons, and place. The caves give us tantalizing hints that they did exactly that. The exact shapes those hints took are still, for the most part, hidden in the dark. And in that darkness, another possibility flickers into view, not above us this time, but inside the mind. Because if some of these images are tied to the sky outside, others may come from a different kind of journey altogether. If you walk that journey inward, the caves themselves start to look very different. Think about what it actually means to go deep into a place like Chauvet or Lascaux or Altamira before anyone had electric light. You leave the open air and the star-filled sky behind. The sounds of wind and insects fade. The temperature drops. The air gets stiller, heavier. Pretty quickly you leave daylight behind too. You're moving by fire. A small flame doesn't just illuminate, it transforms. Shadows jump and crawl across the walls. Animals painted in ochre and charcoal seem to move as the light flickers. Colours shift and pulse. Your sense of distance collapses. That bison might be 3 meters away or half a meter. It's hard to tell because the darkness swallows everything beyond the fire's reach. Sound changes as well. Deep galleries can have strange acoustics. Some chambers in caves like Nio and Lascaux are famous for their echoes, for the way a single clap can roll and repeat. A low voice can sound like a chorus. A drum beat or the rhythmic knocking of stone on stone can turn the whole space into a resonating body. Then there's the air itself. In narrow passages, oxygen can be limited. Add in burning torches, fat lamps, or small hearths, and you begin to alter the balance of gases. Even mild hypoxia, slightly reduced oxygen, can leave people light-headed, prone to dizziness, tingling extremities, a sense that things aren't quite real. Carbon dioxide build-up can give you a feeling of pressure, panic, or unreality. Smoke and smell add another layer. Fat, resin, damp rock, guano. All of that is before anything intentionally ritual happens. It doesn't take much to see why some archaeologists and neuroscientists have suggested that at least some cave art is tied to altered states of consciousness. Trance, vision, what older literature might have called shamanic journeys. The cautious version of this idea goes like this. Many historic hunter-gatherer societies known from ethnography have specialists, call them shamans, ritual leaders, healers, who deliberately enter non-ordinary states. They fast, dance, hyperventilate, chant, use psychoactive plants, or spend long periods in sensory isolation. In these states they report vivid imagery, encounters with animals or spirits, journeys through layered worlds. Their experiences are not just private hallucinations, they're woven into group rituals around healing, initiation, hunting luck, and cosmology. When researchers look at the deep caves, they see a potential fit, underground spaces that require effort and guidance to reach, powerful sensory effects built in, images placed in hidden, hard-to-access spots, occasional signs of repeated burning or pigment application, as if certain panels were reactivated over time. It's not hard to sketch a scenario where specialists lead small groups into these inner chambers for ceremonies that involved altered perception. This is where entoptic patterns come in. Entoptic simply means arising within the visual system itself. Under certain conditions, migraine, fever, prolonged darkness, drugs, intense rhythmic stimulation, many people see simple geometric forms, zigzags, grids, dots, radiating lines, nested curves, spirals, lattices. These shapes are produced by the architecture of the eye and brain. Because they're rooted in shared physiology, they tend to be surprisingly universal. Some of the geometric signs in Ice Age caves look a lot like these entoptic forms. At sites such as El Castillo in Spain or the Maros Pankep caves in Sulawesi, you find repeated series of dots, ladder-like shapes, branching lines, nested chevrons. In France, there are grids, zigzags, and claviform signs that some researchers have loosely mapped onto classic entoptic categories. The argument runs like this. If people in trance commonly see these patterns, and we find similar patterns clustered alongside powerful animal imagery in dark, echoing chambers, maybe some of the signs are visual memories of altered states, recordings, in a sense, of what it felt like when the mind detached from everyday perception. There's a further step, more speculative still. In some societies, ritual specialists describe moving through a tunnel of such patterns into another realm, the realm where animal spirits live, where ancestors dwell, where sickness can be negotiated with or prey can be secured in advance. In that frame, caves themselves, long dark passages ending in image-filled chambers, become almost literal models of the visionary journey. You go inward, past flickering shapes, into a place where animals appear on the walls. It's an elegant story. It ties neurobiology, ethnography, and geology together. But we have to keep our balance here. Altered states are easy to induce and almost impossible to demonstrate archaeologically. No pigment flake or torch stump will ever tell us, on its own, this person was in a trance. Entoptic-like patterns could come from many sources: doodling, counting systems, clan marks, stylized plants, or animals reduced to abstraction. The presence of zigzags and dots does not automatically equal visions. The shamanism hypothesis also risks becoming too powerful. Once you allow "this was a ritual in a trance state" as a universal explanation, it can absorb almost anything. Hard-to-reach chamber must be ritual. Odd sign, vision. Unusual animal, spirit guide. That kind of reasoning feels satisfying but can stop us from asking more fine-grained questions. So a more grounded stance might be, the deep cave environment is naturally conducive to altered perception. It would be surprising if no one ever experienced that or used it. Some geometric signs plausibly resemble known entoptic forms. An ethnographic analogy suggests that ritualized trance is one way humans across many cultures have approached questions of life, death, animals, and meaning. But beyond that, we're in the realm of possibility, not proof. What we can talk about more confidently is what shared rituals, with or without trance, can do for a small Ice Age community. Leading people into a dark cave, lighting the walls with flame, chanting or drumming, focusing attention on particular animals or signs, these acts create a strong sense of us. The group passes through a boundary together, leaves the ordinary world and participates in something set apart. Social psychologists would call this high-intensity, high-synchrony ritual. It tends to produce bonding, commitment, and a feeling of shared reality. For a band living through harsh winters and unpredictable migrations, that kind of cohesion isn't decorative. It's survival technology. Rituals can also structure life transitions. The movement from child to adult, from ordinary hunter to someone trusted with particular knowledge, is often marked by ordeals, darkness, fear, isolation, controlled exposure to strange sights and sounds. A journey into the cave culminating in the first time a youth sees the painted animals flare into life in the lamplight could have been one such passage. Healing, too, is a social process. Whether or not a ritual specialist literally retrieves a lost soul or negotiates with an animal master, the act of gathering around an ailing person, chanting, touching, invoking ancestor animals on the wall can have powerful effects. It offers a framework for suffering, a sense that illness is not random chaos, but part of a story that can be told and perhaps redirected. Most broadly, repeated ceremonies in these charged spaces create shared meaning. The bison in one chamber, the lion in another, the cluster of dots beside a handprint, these become more than pictures. They anchor narratives, taboos, obligations. They can encode who you are, which stories your group tells, which animals you claim as allies or avoid as forbidden. Over time, the cave itself becomes a kind of social memory palace, but one activated by song, movement, and altered perception as much as by sight. So when we stand at the edge of the lamplight today and look into those painted chambers, we're probably seeing more than frozen scenes from everyday life. We're seeing the residue of events that blended environment, body, mind, and community into something we'd recognize as ritual, sometimes quiet and contemplative, sometimes intense enough to bend perception. Exactly what people felt, saw, or believed in those moments is beyond our reach. But the traces they left suggest that the caves weren't just used to record the outer world of animals and seasons. They were also places where inner worlds were explored, shaped, and shared. And that brings us to another interpretive tangle. Once you acknowledge ritual and altered perception, it's tempting to assume that every image is magical, every animal a spell. Were these paintings meant to change the world, bring game, control fate, or simply to reflect it? To get at that, we have to walk carefully into the territory of hunting magic and ask what it would even mean to paint an animal for ethical reasons. When people first began studying Ice Age caves in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they reached for an explanation that felt intuitively right to them: hunting magic. The idea goes like this. In a world where your survival depends on large, dangerous animals, it makes sense to try to influence the hunt before it happens. You paint the bison, the horse, the deer you hope to kill. Maybe you show them wounded, pierced with spears, bleeding. Maybe you surround them, trap them, pin them to the irregularities of the rock. By fixing the animal's image in pigment, you symbolically capture its spirit, weaken it, or persuade the powers of the world to send it into your path. The early evidence seemed to line up. At Lascaux and Altamira, you get these grand processions of animals, herds of horses, bison, aurochs, often in motion, often layered over one another as if many episodes of painting were focused on the same prey species. At some sites, people noticed marks that looked like spears or darts incised or painted over bison and other game. A few ethnographic accounts from much later times, Arctic peoples carving seals, plains groups drawing bison, described rituals where images and hunting success were explicitly linked. Put all that together and you get a simple, satisfying story. The caves are underground hunting shrines. The art is a technology of control. Paint the animal, then kill it. Over the last few decades, though, that picture has frayed. When researchers started systematically cataloguing the animal species in caves like Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira, Neo, and the Sulawesi sites, they noticed something odd. The art is packed with animals that were not the main items on the menu. At Chauvet, lions, rhinos, bears, and panthers dominate the walls. At Lascaux, horses and great aurochs are everywhere. Yet in many associated bone assemblages, people were eating a lot of reindeer and smaller game. Cave lions and rhinos were not regular prey. Some of them might never have been hunted at all. If these were primarily hunting manuals, why lavish attention on the animals you rarely kill and largely ignore the ones you butcher by the hundred? The supposed spear marks turned out to be slippery too. Many are ambiguous scratches or later additions whose meaning we can't fix. Some wounded animals show marks that don't line up with any plausible hunting technique, and many powerful hunting societies with rich art traditions don't depict prey as wounded in advance. They show them whole, proud, or in mythic scenes instead. There's also a deeper conceptual issue. The old hunting magic theory often assumed that Ice Age people thought, in a very straightforward, almost mechanical way, draw animal, get animal. It left little room for symbolism, myth, or the possibility that an image could stand for many things at once. Clan identity, ancestor story, teaching tool, cosmological being, none of which map neatly onto tomorrow's dinner. So some archaeologists pushed back. They pointed out that animals can be sacred without being supper. A lion might be a dangerous neighbour, a rival, a spirit being, an emblem of power. A rhino or a huge aurochs might be less a target and more a personification of a storm, a valley, a season. In that frame, painting is not about practical magic in a narrow sense, but about naming and negotiating a world full of other minds. Still, swinging all the way to its all pure symbol has its own problems. For a small Ice Age community, diet and danger aren't side issues. They shape everything. Where you move, who you ally with, how you schedule ritual. It would be surprising if art that took so much effort had nothing to do with subsistence, or with the emotional weight of the hunt, fear, gratitude, grief, pride. A more nuanced middle position might be this. Ritual and subsistence concerns are not separate boxes. They bleed into each other. A ceremony asking for hunting luck is also a ceremony about identity, obligation and memory. A painted bison can be at the same time an individual animal, a general category of prey, an ancestor, a clan emblem, and a being addressed in prayer. Painting it as if. You're spearing it on the wall doesn't have to mean you literally believe the pigment will force a real bison to fall over tomorrow. It can be a way of rehearsing, acknowledging risk, formalizing hope, and placing the upcoming hunt inside a larger story. When we talk about hunting magic, then, we should be careful. It's easy for that phrase to slide into a stereotype. The primitive person who confuses picture with thing, who can't tell symbol from reality. But symbolic thinking, treating one thing as standing for another, is not a mark of naivety. It's the basis of language, ritual, law, and science. Modern people still perform rituals before exams, games, trips to the hospital. We know in some sense that the gesture doesn't mechanically change the outcome. We do it anyway, because it shapes our own minds and our relationships with others. Respectful inference means granting Ice Age artists at least that level of complexity. They almost certainly understood that a painted aurochs wasn't going to walk out of the wall. The power of the act lived elsewhere, in the gathering, the performance, the continuity with what had been done before, in the way that repeating a pattern makes it true for your group, and that returns us to the puzzle of effort. These paintings and engravings are not quick doodles. They required climbing, scaffolding, lamp fuel, pigments ground from distant minerals, hours or days of focused work deep underground. Many of them were placed where no one would see them in everyday life, behind squeezes, around blind corners, in chambers visited rarely, if at all, by anyone outside a small circle. If the goal was simply to increase hunting success, you might expect something more public, more convenient, marks at the cave mouth, charms on weapons, images in the living areas. Instead, again and again, people chose difficulty and obscurity. That suggests that whatever was happening down there mattered in ways that exceeded daily viewing. The paintings might have worked not as constant visual reminders, but as anchors for occasional highly charged events, rites you only witnessed a few times in a lifetime, if ever. In that light, their hiddenness is part of their function. The animal that knows too much is not for everyone to look at whenever they like. What those rites felt like from the inside and exactly how people believe they shape the hunt remains out of reach. The traces on the walls hold their silence. To get closer, we have to widen our lens again, and ask whether some of these animal gatherings and strange signs might be doing more than invoking prey. Maybe they're also mapping where life happens, valleys, rivers, migration corridors, a kind of remembered landscape folded onto stone. If you live in a world without GPS, without paper maps, without writing, you still have to know exactly where things are, where the herds tend to cross the river when the water is low, where the valley pinches into a treacherous gorge, where there's a spring that never quite dries even in bad years, where the ice stays late and where the berries ripen earliest. In that kind of world, geography isn't an abstract backdrop. It's as vital as the animals themselves. And it's tempting to look at those dense layered cave walls and wonder whether some of the herds we see are also, in a sense, paths. Not just animals in general, but animals as they move through specific remembered landscapes. This is where the idea of mapping comes in. Some researchers have suggested that certain panels might encode rivers, valleys, or migration corridors, lines that run under or alongside animals, repeated pairings of species that actually co-occur in a particular kind of habitat, sequences of figures that always appear in the same order, cave after cave, as if following an invisible itinerary. It's a compelling thought. But we have to tread carefully. Literal maps, the kind we're used to, are very recent. They depend on bird's-eye views and standardized symbols. There's no evidence that Ice Age people were drawing overhead plans of Europe in ochre. When you try to line up a bison panel with the modern shape of a valley, you can always sort of make it work if you squint hard enough. That's the danger. Our pattern-hungry brains are very good at finding rivers where there were only cracks in the rock. A more cautious approach is to think less about cartography and more about memory. Imagine the cave itself as the map. To reach the painted chambers at Lascaux, at Nio, at many sites in France and Spain, you don't just stroll in. You follow a very particular route, down a slope, through a squeeze, across a chamber, around a bend. Archaeologists can see, in the sediment and the soot, that people walk the same paths again and again. The floors are worn in places, hearths recur in the same spots, torch and lamp traces cluster near certain panels, generation after generation. In that sense, the architecture of the cave enforces a sequence. You encounter images in a fixed order, anchored to niches, ledges, and junctions. Turn left at the bison, right at the horse procession, crawl under the low ceiling where the felines are. You can't shuffle the pages. The space itself is a kind of script. This is very close to what memory researchers today call a memory palace. You take a familiar building, assign each room or corner an idea, a story, a set of instructions. Then, when you want to recall them, you mentally walk the building, visiting each spot in turn. Ancient orators describe doing this consciously. But the underlying trick is much older than rhetoric. It's about exploiting how our brains tie information to place. Caves give you that for free. Dark, distinctive, difficult spaces full of landmarks you never confuse with anywhere else. Paint an animal at a particular bend under a particular ceiling bulge, and you've tied whatever that animal means to that location in the mental landscape as well. From this angle, the question isn't, is this a map of the river? But, does this chamber stand for the river? A narrative map doesn't need to look like the thing it encodes. It just has to preserve the order of experience. First you cross the open plain where the horses graze. Then you enter the gorge where the aurochs are dangerous. Then you follow the river bend where you sometimes see lions. A journey like that can be stored as a sequence of panels. Horse, aurochs, lion, each in its own place on the wall, each associated with a particular bend or narrowing of the cave path. Walk the route underground and you rehearse, with your body, how to move through the outer world. Material traces hint that some caves were used this way over very long stretches of time. At Chauvet, at El Castillo, at multiple sites, Radiocarbon dates show episodes of paintings separated by thousands of years, focused on the same sectors. Younger artists return to older panels, adding new animals, new signs, sometimes following the same general arrangements. Hearths pop up in the same alcoves, soot shows up on the same ceilings. It looks less like random decoration and more like revisiting chapters in a well-known story. Does that prove these were route guides in our sense? No. The leap from ordered sequence to map is big, and we lack the intermediate evidence. No carved "you are here" markers, no unambiguous depictions of distinctive mountains or bends in rivers. But it does suggest that spatial information and memory were being woven together. The cave wall becomes a surface where relationships in space and time, where animals tend to be, how the world unfolds as you walk through it, can be condensed and rehearsed. When we talk about maps in Ice Age art, then, it may be wise to think less in terms of scale drawings and more in terms of remembered landscapes. Not what a valley looks like from above, but how it is lived, the order in which beings appear, the dangers and gifts attached to each place, the routes you teach your children not with coordinates, but with stories and sequences. It's an enticing possibility, and it fits with what we know about human memory and movement. Yet it remains, for now, a possibility. The stones don't annotate their own meanings. To push further, we have to leave geography and turn back toward people themselves. How groups mark belonging, how they bind individuals into a shared story traced not just in paths and prey, but in the silhouettes of their own hands. In southern Patagonia, along the canyon of the Rio Pinturas, there's a rock shelter whose name gives away its most obvious secret, Cueva de las Manos, the Cave of the Hands. You walk in, at least in your mind, and the animals are there. Guanaco, the wild camelids that were the lifeblood of the region, along with hunting scenes and abstract patterns. But what arrests people, what almost nobody forgets after seeing even a single photograph, is the sheer density of hands. Left hands, mostly, small and large, layered, overlapping, crowding each other out. Red, black, white, yellow, sometimes even a kind of green. Hundreds of silhouettes built up in clusters over more than 1,000 years. If you were looking for evidence that caves could be records of human presence, not just animal behavior, this is one of the clearest cases we have. Most of the hands are stencils. Someone pressed their hand flat against the rock and blew pigment around it, probably through a bone tube or directly from the mouth, leaving a negative outline. Every one of those silhouettes is a one-to-one trace of an individual body at a particular moment. That palm really touched that stone. Those fingers really splayed that way. And they did it again, and again, and again. Radiocarbon dating of associated deposits shows that the hand panels weren't made all at once in some single, frenzied ceremony. The earliest seem to date back roughly 9,000 years. New hands continue appearing well into the following millennia. The wall becomes a time-lapse of attendance. You could almost imagine it as a guest list, except the signatures are bodies instead of names. This is where repetition starts to mean something different from the repeated bison and horses of Europe. When you see yet another horse at Lascaux, it could be about skill, style, or a theme being revisited. But when you see yet another hand, added to a wall already full of them, you're watching a deliberate choice to join a pre-existing field of marks. You're not just making an image, you're inserting yourself into a pattern. Repetition, here, signals community through time. It tells you this place stayed important long enough for generations to come back. Hands of adolescents next to hands of children, next to the broader prints of adults. Some are crisp and bright, others are faded, half eroded. New stencils spill over older ones, obscuring them but also, in a sense, protecting them under more recent pigment. This is the archaeological trace of a social habit. We go there, we add ourselves. You can feel a similar impulse in European hand traditions, though the scale is different. At Chauvet, at El Castillo, at Pechmerle, hand stencils are scattered among the animals and signs. Some are high on ceilings, some deep in recesses. In a few caves they cluster in particular alcoves, almost like little hand-only shrines. The techniques are much the same, negative stencils likely produced by blowing or spitting paint. But there is something distinctive about the Patagonian canyon face, where cliff after cliff bears these dense rhythmic bands of hands. In Europe, hands feel like a powerful but secondary motif, woven into a larger tapestry of creatures and symbols. In Patagonia, for stretches of wall they are the tapestry. What is being recorded on that rock? Not in our sense of record as neutral data storage, but in the sense of what is being fixed, made durable. One possibility is simple presence. I was here. We were here. In a landscape of high cliffs and narrow valleys, where groups might move seasonally and return to the same sheltered spots year after year, freezing those returns in pigment makes sense. Each hand could be a moment of arrival, a ritual start to a hunt, a rite of passage when a young person joins the ranks of full participants. Another possibility is belonging. Perhaps not everyone's hand went on the wall. Maybe only certain lineages, or successful hunters, or initiates in a particular ceremony. In that case, the panel becomes a roster of a more restricted kind of membership. You don't just exist, you count. There are hints that something like lineage may be in play. Some hands have missing fingers, not from injury on the skeletons we've found, but as if the finger was folded under when the stencil was made. In European caves, similar patterns appear, and some researchers have proposed that these could be a simple code. Combinations of extended and tucked fingers creating sequences, like a family emblem or a personal mark. At Cueva de las Manos, we don't know if that's true, but the potential is there. The body becomes a cipher system, a clan, expressed as a particular configuration of digits. Beyond presence and belonging, there's the idea of collective memory. Imagine a child standing in front of that wall, tracing the outlines with their eyes as an elder speaks. These were our grandmothers and their brothers and the people before them. They hunted here when the river was lower. They saw the guanaco cross that ridge. We come as they came, and we place our hands where they did, so they remember us and we remember them. You don't need writing to create a genealogy. You just need a durable surface, a repeatable act, and a story that binds both together. A wall of hands is all three, and notice what this does to our picture of cave art as a whole. It pushes us away from the idea that there was one Paleolithic religion, or one canonical set of meanings that flowed unchanged from France to Spain to Indonesia. Instead, it shows that the basic act, using pigment on stone to anchor meaning, can support very different social projects in different places, while still tapping into some recurring human impulses. People in Europe, people in Sulawesi, people in Patagonia, separated by oceans and tens of thousands of years, all arrived at hand stencils. All found something emotionally and cognitively satisfying about framing their own silhouettes on rock. That's probably not a coincidence. Our hands are how we grasp, point, give, receive, signal. They're our most visible tools and our most obvious markers of individuality. To fix them in place is to declare, a particular someone with this reach, this span, touched here. Cueva de las Manos widens the lens in another way too. For a long time, the story of real cave art was told as if it were mainly a European achievement, centered on famous sites like Lascaux and Altamira. Then Sulawesi forced a rethinking. Figurative art and hand stencils were also appearing very early in Southeast Asia. Patagonia shows that the urge to turn rock shelters into long-term social archives wasn't confined to any one continent, climate, or subsistence strategy. These paintings are global behaviour, not a single cultural script diffusing from a European or African homeland, but a recurring solution to the same set of problems: how to mark places as ours, how to knit individuals into groups, how to keep memory anchored when everything else, seasons, animals, rivers, even coastlines, is in motion. When we stand in front of those stenciled walls, physically or in imagination, we're not just looking at art. We're looking at a language of community that predates writing by many millennia. A language spoken in negative space, in layered pigments, in the simple act of putting your hand where countless others have been. And yet, as with maps and calendars and animal panels, the stones stay quiet about the details: presence, belonging, lineage, remembrance. They all fit what we see. None can be proven. To move closer, we have to pull back once more from specific sites and face the hardest part of this whole investigation, admitting how much the caves still refuse to tell us and how big the gap is between our questions and the answers they left. If we gather everything we've seen so far and lay it out quietly, away from the wilder theories, a pattern begins to form. Whatever else they were, the caves were places where careful observation got fixed into pigment. The animals are drawn with the kind of precision that only comes from long watching. The way a bison's shoulder hunches before it turns, the twist in a horse's neck mid-gallop, the seasonal thickness of a reindeer's coat. At Chauvet and Lascaux, the herds aren't generic. They're rendered with diagnostic details that let specialists tell species, sex, sometimes even age classes. That is field work, done without notebooks, stored on limestone. Alongside that, there's the evidence for skilled practice. The superimposed figures at Lascaux, the layered lions at Chauvet, the overlapping bison at Altamira, these aren't clumsy. They show control over perspective, contour, the illusion of motion. They also show correction, older lines reworked, new lines traced over faint ones, as if the wall itself was a training ground and workshop. Some panels read like portfolios, places where high-skill individuals returned again and again, elaborating the same themes. The caves become both classroom and gallery. Then there is the social side. Cueva de las Manos gave us one version of that, a wall as a slow-building ledger of presence and belonging. In Europe, the same social currents show up differently, through repeated motifs that turn up far from each other. Certain abstract signs, for instance, recur across dozens of caves: ladders, claviforms, dots in gravitationally arranged clusters, hand stencils in preferred colours, vulva-like ovals. They appear in Chauvet's deep chambers, at El Castillo in northern Spain, on rock outside shelters in the French Pyrenees. Even if we don't know exactly what they meant, their persistence is telling. People were not improvising from scratch every time they lit a torch. They were working within shared conventions, reusing shapes, revisiting combinations. That is what culture looks like: repetition with variation, a vocabulary drawn on by different hands over centuries. So on the side of what we can say with some confidence, we have this: close animal observation, repeating practice that refines skill, and socially meaningful motifs that travel and endure. Taken together, the caves function as records of expertise in hunting, in season watching, in social identity, and in the craft of making images that carry all of that. The hardest questions sit in the spaces between those certainties. The first is whether those recurring signs formed anything like a structured system. Were they just favourite shapes, used because they felt powerful or looked pleasing? Or were they closer to a set of signs with stable meanings? This herd, this clan, this season, this ritual, that could be combined into messages. Researchers like Genevieve von Petzinger have catalogued dozens of recurring marks in European caves, and shown that a small subset accounts for most of them. That's exactly what you'd expect from a sign system, where a limited alphabet gets reused. But we don't yet have the Rosetta Stone that would tell us how they functioned. Related to that is the mystery of narrative. When you see a panel full of animals, or a sequence of hand stencils marching along a wall, is that a story? Are events being shown in order, like frames in a comic, or is it more like a cluster of themes? These are the beings and acts that matter here, arranged according to a logic we no longer share. A few compositions hint at sequence. Lines of horses that seem to move from one end of the wall to another. Scenes where humans, animals, and abstract signs intersect in what looks like action. But without captions, we can't say if these are narrative in our sense, or more like layered icons, each one invoking a bundle of associations. Then there is the stubborn question of location. Why this chamber, not that one? At Lascaux, some of the richest paintings in the Hall of the Bulls sit at a kind of crossroads in the cave system, while other extraordinary panels are tucked much deeper in, reached only by crawling through narrow passages. At Chauvet, the most striking lions and rhinos appear in spaces that are difficult and dangerous to access. Many caves have large, easily accessible chambers with almost no art, and small, awkward niches where pigment is dense. The choices clearly mattered. They obeyed some logic. Acoustic properties, darkness, safety from water damage, ritual staging, restricted access, that we can only partially reconstruct. When people describe these paintings as feeling like they know too much, it's tempting to reach for hidden sciences, star catalogues, encoded catastrophe myths, secret maps of past coastlines. Those ideas are compelling enough that we'll probably always see them resurface. But if we slow down, the too much begins to look less like esoteric knowledge and more like deep familiarity with the things that governed survival. Knowing exactly when a particular herd tends to calve and where it crosses a valley. Knowing the rhythm of salmon runs or the days when certain birds arrive. Knowing which rocks ring, which chambers boom, which winds scour or shelter. Knowing how clouds collect on a certain ridge before snow. These are not lesser forms of knowledge. For Ice Age people, they were everything. A panel that ties together bison in a particular posture, a phase of the moon, and a series of dots may not be a star chart in the modern astronomical sense. It may be a compact way of saying, when the world looks like this, and the sky does that, it is time to move, or hunt, or gather, or stay away. That kind of expertise can easily feel unsettlingly precise when we glimpse it from far away. It is not secret science, but it is science in the most grounded sense. Systematic observation turned into practice, then anchored in images and shared. Our position, looking back through tens of thousands of years, has to be a careful one. For each cave, for each cluster of motifs, the responsible approach is to hold multiple working hypotheses in mind at the same time. That a panel might be a hunting aid, a memory palace of seasonal cues, a ritual stage, a lineage marker, a teaching tool for the young, or several of those at once. As dating methods sharpen, as we map cave acoustics and microclimates, as we compare more regions like Sulawesi and Patagonia to the famous European sites, some of those hypotheses get a little stronger, others fade. We are not trying to force the caves into a single answer, but to let the evidence slowly prune our guesses. If you'd like to go deeper into that process, to see the studies and stories behind these ideas laid out in a gentler arc than we can fit here, there's a book that expands on tonight's episode with full references and some additional sites we haven't visited. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com, and for this week there's a small discount there for listeners who want to wander further into the dark with a lamp of their own. For now, though, we stay with the not knowing. The animals, the signs, the hands, the careful placement in echoing chambers. They all insist that something specific was being done, again and again, for reasons that made sense to the people who climbed down with their lamps and pigments. We can trace the outlines of their expertise and feel the weight of their attention. What we can't yet do is read their walls as fluently as they could. And as we move into the final part of our journey, we'll sit for a moment with that gap. We'll follow the torchlight to the deepest chambers, where the paintings are most hidden, and ask what it meant to close these spaces off, not just physically, but in memory, to end the practice of going in and adding more, to let the record stop. In many of these caves, what strikes archaeologists is not just that the painting stopped, but that the caves themselves seem to have been, in a sense, closed. Entrances silted over and were left that way. Pathways that had been carefully maintained for generations went unused. In some places there are signs that rocks were deliberately stacked, or that access routes were allowed to collapse and never cleared again. The last torches gutted out, the last hand withdrew, and the darkness was left to seal the record. What remains for us is a set of fragments that all point in the same broad direction. The paintings are not random. Across Europe, in Sulawesi, in Patagonia, we see minds paying disciplined attention to patterns, to animal behaviour and seasonal cycles, to the movement of groups through landscapes, and very possibly to regularities in the sky. The dots and lines and repeated signs are not accidental doodles. They are part of a shared effort to pin down things that returned, herds, winds, phases of light and dark, so that memory could be steadier than perception. At the same time, we do not have a key that unlocks a single, definitive reading. Most specialists would agree that the animals themselves and their behaviours are central, that social identity and ritual practice are woven through many panels, that some arrangements of signs plausibly track lunar or seasonal rhythms. Beyond that, we step into gradients of likelihood rather than firm ground. Star maps, encoded disaster tales, fully grammatical proto-writing systems, these remain possibilities, but not yet proofs. The more we learn, the more important it becomes to keep those categories separate, what the dates, pigments, and context support strongly, and what still sits in the realm of careful speculation. If you've stayed with this journey into the dark, and you'd like to linger with more of these prehistoric puzzles, there's a book that gathers them in a slower, more detailed way, with notes and sources you can follow at your own pace. You can find out more and pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. If this kind of quiet exploration speaks to you, you can also help us keep making it. Subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and sharing a comment all tell the strange little algorithms that there's an audience for long walks into deep time. I'd especially love to hear where you're listening from tonight, what part of the world you're in, and maybe what your own night sky looks like when you step outside. As we leave the caves and let the stone close behind us, one question comes with us into the room where you are now. If you had only rock and pigment, only stone and darkness, and you wanted to leave a trace for minds far beyond your own time, what pattern would you choose to record?